Good morning, good afternoon, in fact. Everybody, welcome to this Healthcare World series session. My name is Steve Gardner. I'm the Managing Director of Healthcare World, and I have a fantastic panel with me today to talk about my own home healthcare market, the UK, and the opportunities that the UK can offer to international entrants. Joining me today, I have Matt Oram, the Chief Executive of Advise Inc., who analysed spend data for the NHS. I have David Lawson, who is the Chief Procurement Officer for the world-renowned NHS Foundation Trust at Guy's and St Thomas's. Vincent Buscemi, Head of Healthcare and Social Care at Lawyers Bevan Britton. I have Adam Townsend, who is the Chief Executive of Viewit, who are analysed NHS data and allow organisations to understand the UK landscape. And finally, Jyoti Mahan, who is the Chief Executive of Healthcare First, who are a healthcare provider, a primary care provider in the north of England. Where does one start with the UK healthcare system? It's unlike any other healthcare system in the world. Free at the point of delivery since 1948, when the NHS was formed, paid for entirely by taxation. The common misconception is that the NHS is one thing, when in point of fact it's many. Its constituent parts are foundation trusts, primary care organisations. Constant change and reorganisation is a huge part of the NHS, but it's a massive sacred cow in the UK and something which is incredibly valuable to all of the UK citizens. We also have a vibrant private sector that sits alongside it. So how does one get involved in working in such a vibrant and interesting and healthcare system? As I say, great panel to discuss that. And I think, firstly, I've given a few little insights into my own feelings about what the NHS is and how it works. But I think the best place to start is to ask that very question. So, guys, if an alien landed in a field in Norfolk, how would you explain the National Healthcare Service to it? First person to ask that question is not an alien landing in a field in Norfolk, but indeed an American who has been part of our UK healthcare system and healthcare scene for many years now, but probably uniquely qualified to answer this question. Vincent, do you want to start us off on this one?
Thank you, Steve. Yes. Hi, everybody. Well, I would describe the NHS as being complex in a single word, but to expand beyond that, it needs to be understood that the NHS is huge. It's not as many people believe, and as I was one of those individuals before I moved here many years ago, that the NHS is one thing. It's one organization made up of different elements, and when interfacing with the NHS, you're interfacing with a single organization. That simply isn't the case. The NHS is made up of a multitude of organizations, independent of one another, but nevertheless working together as a system. And those organizations include a range of national bodies that oversee NHS services, such as NHS England, NHS Scotland, NHS Wales, and then NHS Northern Ireland, which is also an important point to make, that when we talk about the NHS in the UK, it's actually 4 different systems, and each of those systems in the regions, if we can describe it like that, are mutually exclusive from one another. And whilst there's differences between the regional health services, those differences are mainly structural. So I think probably today, given this panel, we'll be coming to this from the perspective of the NHS in England, as it were. So as I say, we have our national bodies, NHS England and others, like CQC, which is the Care Quality Commission. Then there's a range of integrated care boards from the 1st of July, which plan and commission care for the local populations, and there's 42 of those. But then, as Steve mentioned, there's a range of healthcare providers, and these, of course, are divided according to the type of services they provide, whether it's primary care, which is our general practitioners, dentists, community pharmacies, opticians, or the acute hospital trusts, like David comes from at Guy's and St Thomas's. There's mental health trusts, but there's also community trusts and ambulance trusts. So all working together as a system with local authorities who provide a wide range of public health and social care services, and of course, charities, social enterprises, and independent sector providers. But of course, on top of that, you also have a range of arm's length bodies such as Health Education England, NHS Digital, Human Research Authority, the Human Tissue Authority. You have various special health authorities who provide services into the NHS. Those are like NHS Blood and Transplant, Counter Fraud. And then you have executive agencies such as the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency, the UK Health Security Agency, and then a number of non-departmental public bodies as well. So as you come to see, you have many, many organizations employing hundreds of thousands of people, providing services to 60 odd million of us every single day, free at the point of delivery, regardless of one's ability to pay. So it's quite a complex but interesting system of health services. And as Steve says, funded entirely through taxation rather than insurance. But there is a private health market that sits alongside of that.
I think that's a really good and comprehensive view of the NHS. And for anybody who is watching from overseas, don't be too scared by that. It sounds complicated. It sounds like a lot. But actually, at its heart, it's reasonably simple in terms of understanding how the bodies fit together. And I guess probably to ask that question of how do the constituent parts get the parts fit together, probably ask somebody who works within that system. David, do you want to come in and give a little bit of a perspective from you as somebody who sits within the NHS system on how the bits hang together and how the kind of money and opportunities flow?
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I mean, I'm actually sat in St Thomas Hospital as I speak today, so I'm very much within the system, literally. I guess just the other point in terms of how to describe the NHS. So we've mentioned a few times about free at the point of view. So I guess the other key principle of the NHS is universal in terms of the breadth of treatment and services that the NHS provides to the patient population. And if I look at Guy's and St Thomas's, I think as a hospital, we provide every single treatment available on the NHS with the exception of bone marrow transplant. So as well as having kind of fairly complex acute activity in the hospital, in terms of robotic surgery and genomics and so forth. We also have quite a large community setting as well. So I guess the other, if I was an alien landing in Norfolk, I think the other key point is the NHS is universal in terms of the breadth of cover that it provides. In terms of how it kind of works together, I guess at a national level, you've got what's called NHS England and Improvement, and they very much kind of control the delivery of the NHS in terms of setting the priorities and kind of commissioning, and then alongside NHSEI, you've got an organisation called the CQC, which is the Care Quality Commission, and they act as a kind of national regulator. So as an individual hospital within the system, we are regulated by the CQC to make sure that we're providing patient care to appropriate standards. At a regional level, then you have with NHS England and Improvement have regional teams. So I think across the country, there's 7 or 8 regional teams. So there's a London regional team within NHS England and Improvement, and they again set at a regional level what the priorities and targets are for the region. And then below the region, you have what's called the Integrated Care Systems, ICSs, which were established in law last Friday, and so within Guy's and St Thomas's, we are part of the South East London ICS, and that's about the commissioning and the providers working in a collaborative way for our local patient population. So very much at the moment a trend around a kind of concept, I guess, of integrated care. So we're looking at the patient population for our local sub-region, and that's about trying to have a more joined up approach. In terms of funding, so funding comes down from government into NHSEI. There's certain services which are subject to what's called specialised commissioning. So they're commissioned at a national level. And so what you find is particularly large teaching hospitals like St Thomas's, a disproportionate amount of our activity and our income is linked to doing specialist activity, which is commissioned at a national level. And then you have funding that flows down into the ICSs for activity to be commissioned at a local level. So you have different kind of funding routes. There is an independent sector outside of the NHS. It is smaller in scale compared to, I guess, other countries. What you're finding during COVID and post-COVID is that there's a lot more collaboration between the NHS and the independent sector, particularly around clearing patient backlogs. So for example, if you look at Guy's and St Thomas's, where we're commissioning space with our local kind of private hospital next door at London Bridge to help clear out our backlogs. So a lot more kind of close collaboration, I think, with the independent sector and the NHS, and also within hospitals and regions as a kind of consequence, I think, of COVID. So I'll hand back to you, Steve.
Thanks, David. That's really, really helpful. There's a couple of points I'd like to add actually to what David just said. I mean, in terms of that funding cascade, as it were, NHS England in Improvement is the body that governs the NHS as a whole. But of course, the funding ultimately originally comes from the UK's Department of Health. So if you were hierarchically looking at this from the top down, you're going from the Department of Health to NHS England, and then either through that specialist care, the route that David was talking about, into those nationally procured elements, or into the ICSs, and from the ICSs into acute hospital trusts, primary care, and so forth. The other thing that I think is really important to note from an international audience point of view is the fact that as a citizen of the UK, I can walk into an NHS hospital or an A&E, an accident and emergency department, and expect to be treated. We don't have an insurance card-based system. There is no national insurance element to this at the point of delivery. While there is a national insurance levy that's charged on wages, you don't see, and to the UK population, this system seems, to all intents and purposes, to be free. It's paid for entirely out of taxation. And I think that's a really, really important point just to kind of make, just to give that kind of a frame how this works. So I guess, Matt, I'm going to come to you next. You look at kind of spend data, you look at how and where organisations in the NHS, trusts like David's, spend their money. The NHS then is clearly rooted in the idea of value-based healthcare. Explain for us, if you could, how that works. How does the NHS go about making sure it gets best value for its spend?
Yeah, it's probably quite a big answer to that question. I guess there's probably all different sorts of angles. I think traditionally there's been a focus, and when I say traditionally, there still is, because there always is going to be, around price. So the value component around, are we just paying the best price for products? And that's typically where we've helped NHS trusts over the last 8 years as a business in helping them analyse their spend. I think there is now more of a shift for certain areas to value-based procurement, where it's probably less about the price of a product. And actually, if you think about the total cost of products, there's all sorts of procedures now where it might actually cost more for a product, but actually the patient stay is halved. They don't need a general anaesthetic, it's a local anaesthetic. They recover within a day, whereas the other way is 3 weeks. So whilst you might be spending more on the product element, actually overall there is better value and a better patient outcome. So there's a lot more of that we're seeing now, and David may have examples of some of that. So you start to see that, you start to see more clinician involvement. I think David would probably argue clinicians have always been involved, which I think is true, but you're seeing more and more now focus on getting more parties involved in the procurement process, as opposed to it just being seen to be a transactional thing that somebody decided they want to buy something, we just buy it and it arrives. It's now questions asked about, do we need to buy it? How many do we need to buy? So there's a lot more parties now involved in those conversations. Also, the procurement landscape has changed a lot in recent years. There used to be You'd argue there used to be a national team called PASA, the Purchasing and Supply Agency, that sourced products nationally for the country. You then had the creation of procurement hubs about 15 years ago. A number of those existed around the country, although half of those have disappeared. And then you had local trust teams doing things. And what you're now seeing more of, you're seeing national category tower providers. So these are people that are teams that will source products on behalf of the country. For example, there's one that looks after orthopedics, there's one that looks after cardiology. Those people will source with clinicians saying these are the products we should be buying. NHS supply chain then will supply them into hospitals. So there's a lot more spend now going through NHS supply chain. And actually, you'd argue now a lot of the local teams are doing more regional work. So where a local team would just sit buying for their own hospital, it's rare that's the case now with the advent of ICSs, and David's always been kind of ahead of the curve with his own organisation with Smart Together that's been buying on behalf of many trusts for a long time to get that economy of scale. Because I think the reality is some products are best sourced nationally. They're best a national deal is done. There's some products and services that are best done regionally, and there's some stuff that's best done locally. So for example, you wouldn't contract a window cleaning service nationally, because nobody can provide window cleaning services nationally. So it's just looking at what level is best to do each of those.
And is it an issue that if you're approaching the NHS, you're approaching the UK market, you're approaching the UK landscape, is there an issue or a difficulty in understanding at what level you need to approach, and how would you advise people about working out which level they should approach at?
Definitely, yeah, I get that. You just talked about the complexity of the market, people thinking that there is one customer and I'll just go and talk to the NHS, and as everybody's just heard, it's a lot more complex than that. And then when you look at the procurement space itself, it gets even more complex with all the different layers. I still believe the right way, it might not be technically the right way, but the best conversation to be had is with somebody like David. And I don't want everybody now flooding David's inbox because he'll be swamped. Yeah, he's just covering his face now. But it is a chief procurement officer, somebody running a hospital team, because they're the closest to where the action is. They're the ones that are seeing patients walking in and out of their building every day. That's where the real work's happening. So they understand what's required, and actually they can usually give you a very quick view of, yep, something like that would be great, now go and speak to these people. Whereas I think you'd probably find it harder trying to get in at a national or a regional level, just because they're so busy, they've got massive programs of work as a supplier trying to get in through the door. That's where you ultimately may land, but actually a conversation with somebody who works in a hospital is usually, I would say, the best person to talk to.
It's an interesting one, isn't it? Because
David was going to correct me there. Let's come and speak to David.
Just to echo what Matt said, sometimes when people look at the NHS, they get overwhelmed by its complexity, and we've probably contributed that by articulating its complexity. And often suppliers who try and sell to the NHS often spend a lot of time engaging with the wrong people at the wrong level, and ultimately the people who are buying the products or the services generally are at a hospital level. So from a supply point of view, trying to understand your market is important, but understand who's actually buying your products. The other thing I was going to add, though, is that the other organisations that we haven't really touched on is the academic health science networks. So there's about 15 AHSNs around the country, and you can Google AHSNs and it'll give you the detail. But their purpose is to increase adoption of innovation, and they're funded through from NHS England, and their primary purpose is to help be a facilitator between industry and the NHS and focus on innovation adoption. So they do provide kind of guidance for UK and overseas suppliers, and they can help at a local level signpost and give advice about which organizations, which hospitals would be most potentially interested in your particular product. They will help kind of sanity check whether what you're proposing or offering is meeting the need. One of the challenges for any health system is there's almost too much innovation, there's too much choice, and so we have to work through how do we how do we kind of prioritize and identify those innovations that are going to have the biggest impact? So the AHSN network would also be another route, I think, to help you kind of navigate what can look like quite a complex system.
An interesting one. I mean, what I was going to say though, which I think again it bears out what both you and Matt have said, David, is that it's any health system that you get involved in, any country that you want to enter the market for, is going to have its issues, is going to have its complexities. And the first and most important thing is to speak to somebody who has the contacts, the understanding, and the knowledge to be able to route you in the right direction. So that whole thing about understanding not just the system, its complexities and how it comes together, but also what the individual organisations are, where your product might most reasonably slot into that system, and how you kind of get involved, who you talk to is really, really important. That kind of trusted partner that can help you. But also kind of understanding the size of the market and understanding the volumes that are involved. And Adam, I think that's where I'm going to bring you in. You've got your finger on the pulse in terms of looking at that NHS England data. What's your perception in terms of where the kind of big need areas are? What's your perception in terms of how you could bring to bear some ideas around potential market volumes? And you're on mute, Adam. So
first one, apologies. I think first one, going back to the alien question. The NHS is incredibly well regulated. It has huge governance and assurance structures and support structures around it. However, as that moves down into putting the services onto the ground, the management variability and interpretation of that regulation framework and how it interacts with it creates a huge amount of noise. I think I'd like to say that in the clinical space, there's less variation. So yes, I'm sure, like every system, people have their own preferred clinical practices. But I think I'd like to say there's a lot less variation in the way that we deliver clinical services than there is in the way we manage them. And I think engaging with clinicians who use the products that people might be wanting to bring into the UK is a good starting point, because they will be your advocates and your champions in the marketplace as you move up to the point where you may have something that needs to be procured. I think the NHS is equally cursed and blessed in that we are improving health outcomes, so the population's aging, which means we've got more people needing its services. But as the population ages, we've got less people who are able to pay for it. So there is a dichotomy here of as we get better at treating people, our ability to pay for the services that they use, because it's free at the point of use, becomes harder. I think I'd balance that out by saying, as we move into the next phase of the NHS's structure, I think we're finally starting to realise that it's cheaper to keep people healthy than to treat them well when they're ill. And that brings a need to understand the activity across more than just how many widgets is the hospital using, and that need to be able to understand if we deploy products into primary care that will help stabilise people and prevent hospital episodes, what costs are we displacing in one part of the system that potentially could fund at a cheaper treatment point an intervention elsewhere. And the journey that the NHS is about to go on, which says I want to spend £1 million in one part of the system, and I'm expecting that I will save £2 million in a different part of the system. First of all, that takes time to wash through. So the activity that we are, as we pump prime a better way of working with the population to keep them healthy, we're not going to see the benefit of that in for example, acute provision until backlogs are removed and until we reach a more stable position. But the real key for me now is that understanding the populations that are out there what activities taking place and how could we serve them with different solutions to keep them well, and being able to map that through the activity in the NHS to the point where we can say we could reasonably expect that a cost here will create benefit here, and here's the demonstration of how the activity should diminish over time based on a golden thread that goes all the way back to treat it here, don't treat it here. So we're very, very fortunate that a lot of, certainly within NHS England, that activity data is published. The unfortunate thing as an entrant, I would say, is that the acronyms and the lingo and the absence of a single source of what does that code actually mean make that incredibly hard. But fundamentally, as the NHS looks to innovation and people with products that they'd like to bring in to create solutions, as I say, that are keeping people healthy rather than treating them, the data sets exist to be able to articulate what that benefit should be. So as a supplier, you ought to be able to frame a business case that says, here's your data played back to you about what the likely benefits will be at sometimes a very, very granular level.
Yeah, I think the fact that data exists is brilliant. The difficulty is actually kind of accessing it and getting to it. But I guess that's kind of where you can help. So that's an important element of the service that you provide. Couple of things. I mean, firstly, I think the alphabetic spaghetti of the NHS is always a really interesting and challenging issue. One of the great things about having a free at the point of delivery healthcare system, which is funded by government, is the fact that government does have a tendency to like to get a little bit involved every now and then. And as a result, what we do end up with in the UK, I think more than in a lot of healthcare systems around the world, is a kind of atmosphere of constant change. So at the moment, David mentioned that ICSs have come into existence, and formally, I think only in the last week or so. But I think in my lifetime, I'm old enough to remember SHAs and CCGs and probably just about every other combination of letters in the alphabet that you can imagine. So from that point of view, one piece of advice that I would give to market entrants coming into the UK is make sure that your understanding and knowledge of the system is up to date, because it is subject to a degree of change. I also want to just put a quick notice out there to our audience that you all have a big red button right underneath the screen that I'm speaking on that says ask a question. We've got the right experts in the room here in order to be able to help you to understand what you need to know about the NHS, what you need to know about the UK market, and how you can potentially get involved in it. And I've got a question actually already from a trailblazer in that regard. Whoever you are, you haven't actually put your name on this question, so I would encourage those of you that send them through as we go along to do so. The question I have is this, and open to whichever member of the panel would like to take it. Are there particular areas of innovation and activity that the UK and the NHS are focusing on? Are there particular areas that we're looking for help and assistance in? Does anybody want to have a kind of insight into that? Guys, don't all put your hands up at once. Adam, go for it.
Yeah, I think I touched on it earlier, but the recognition that both from a patient outcome and financially, it is better to keep a population healthy than treat it when it's sick, means that I think that the NHS is now reaching out to organisations and manufacturers who can bring things to market that do just that, whether it's remote monitoring. So, we're in the system. We see this with the ICSs that we work with. The expectation that acute demand will at least be level and not increasing over the coming years, and potentially dropping away in spite of the aging population. I think if there's an opportunity where the NHS would reach out to people, it would be around solutions that keep people stable, allow them to be monitored without face-to-face clinical intervention. So some of the conditions that are in acute hospitals, and we saw this with some of the COVID patients, where actually we could monitor their oxygen levels remotely from home and reduce their length of stay by 4, 5, 6 days, depending on their age. So I and David probably, you know, would have a closer view than me on this. But that ability to stop the admission and to limit the days a patient is in a bed to the ones where they actually only need acute care and monitoring rather than routine observations, moving that out of the hospital is, for me, is the big, I think that's the big ticket for the next 3-4 years. But as I said, well, you know, David, you know, it's your world more than mine, but.
Well, David has unmuted, so I think he wants to come in on this point. So, David,
I mean, just to add to that, I mean, I guess the other link to that is kind of early diagnostics is a key area of focus as well. So to catch things quicker, and again, the impact of COVID in terms of what people are used to doing, are happy to do in terms of diagnostics at home, which was never really considered pre-COVID. So a lot of focus on kind of preventative activity, early diagnostics. The other thing to look at in more detail is if one of the programs NHS England fund is called the Accelerated Access Collaborative, and that's a national initiative where they identify at a national level key areas of priority for innovation, and they actively look to promote those particular priorities. So if you're looking at kind of what are the signals from the NHS about what the NHS sees as key priorities, then if you look at the Accelerated Access Programme, if you look at their materials on the internet, that gives you a kind of indication of the type of initiatives that at a national level they're trying to focus attention on. So again, there's lots of, it's a complex system, but there's particular initiatives that are really focused on encouraging specific innovation, and the Accelerated Access Collaborative is one of those.
Thanks, David. Actually, I'm just kind of sort of following up slightly on that. I mean, is there an element of, you know, we talked earlier on in the conversation about being able to get in at the right level and being able to get the right conversation with the right person. Is that problem magnified when you've got something which is new and innovative and different? Because how easy is it for a system which I guess kind of revolves around kind of almost kind of reactive procurement to actually deal with a thing that it doesn't necessarily understand or need or know that it needs yet? Does that make sense as a question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the challenge from a procurement perspective is that every supplier that approaches me is innovative. You know, every supplier will say our products are innovative, whether that's a step change or iterative. So it can be quite difficult from a buying perspective or from a system perspective to kind of sift out and identify actually which of these innovations makes most impact. So that is a challenge that's not unique to the NHS. That's a challenge for health systems around the world. I think what you're seeing in the NHS is a recognition of the issue, and therefore look that the way that the NHS is looking at addressing that is around data, and particularly around outcome data, and increasingly use of outcome data to measure impact and identify those innovations that and those needs to kind of demand signal to the market. These are the things that we need to focus on. So I think what you'll see over the next few years is a further kind of increase in work to use data. And where there's gaps in the data, for example, in terms of registries, for example, is to fill those gaps so that we, as a system, we can make more informed decisions about which innovations to prioritize, but also to signal to the market, these are the areas that we need to find solutions and develop solutions that may not exist. I guess the other point I'd say, I mean, I keep mentioning about COVID. COVID's had quite a big impact in terms of people's willingness to make change. So with COVID, people had to change. They had no choice but change. But that mindset, I think the aim is to try and carry through that mindset where people are more willing to change processes, change practice, whereas previously there'd have been a greater reluctance to make a change.
Thanks, David. Vincent, you had your hand up a moment ago. Did you want to come in on this point?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I actually was going to make a couple of similar points to what David had mentioned around the NHS Innovation Accelerator and the overall link with the academic health science networks, because it's really easy at the moment for people to sort of focus on digitization and digital health. And there's lots of software solutions that are looking to be sourced within the NHS, whether it's for remote monitoring or remote consultation. But beyond the digital platforms for those sorts of things, and for the preventative healthcare through implantables and wearables, there's more traditional innovations that the NHS is looking for as well. And whilst they don't get wrapped up in the sort of med tech, digi-health, life sciences basket, there are still lots of opportunities for organizations who are providing what I would describe as traditional goods or traditional patient-facing services to work with the NHS. And I wouldn't want your viewers to lose sight of that, because the one thing that we do have in the NHS, no matter how fantastically good we say it is, and it is very, very good, the reality is, as a consequence of the last couple of years, there is a large number of people waiting for elective surgery. And there's a whole framework that now exists in terms of increasing capacity framework for traditional providers of services across a multitude of clinical specialisms to get involved in providing those services that patients in the NHS actually require. And whilst that's at a national level, as David said earlier, there's lots of hospital trusts who provide these services, who are looking at innovative ways of collaborating with non-NHS providers within the charities, third sector, and independent health sector around assisting with backlog and NHS waiting list initiatives. So there's lots of opportunities, and it's a really interesting and good time to get involved in NHS services generally.
Thanks, Vincent. Adam, you also had your hand up. Did you want to make a point?
Yeah, it was just to talk about those, understanding the latent demand for those products that we may be bringing to market, and the fact that, again, within the data world in the English NHS, we know because the GPs record it and publish it, how many people have specific long-term conditions. So people with cardiac issues or respiratory issues or diabetes, we can see that population, and so in terms of being able to articulate to a procurement organization just why they should engage in something that isn't a one-for-one relationship, but we know where those hotspots of diabetic patients are and which GPs are serving them. We ought to be able to play that back into the procurement process. So if we know we've got 100,000 people in a given geography that are on diabetic registers, and we have a product that could support them to avoid diabetic inpatient acute hospital episodes, it's in the NHS's interest to play those numbers back into any procurement proposal to show the value proposition. So yeah, it was just to make that point, really. That
it's a really interesting point, Adam. I mean, at the end of the day, the data is there, the information is there, and from both the system itself's perspective in terms of understanding where its hotspots and where its needs and requirements are, and equally from the perspective of a supplier that we wanted to help bring into the UK market, understanding where the need is a hugely important part of that. And it's actually, I mean, I have to say, thank you, audience. I will get around to as many of these questions that are flooding my inbox as I possibly can. There's a point actually that somebody described calling themselves N has made around, if you look at the system, I mean, they're talking there particularly about A&E and a system that's kind of fundamentally overwhelmed. So, that whole idea of understanding where the issues are, where the problems are, and how you solve them, I think is really important. Another point from a lady called Kathy Hubble that I want to kind of put to the panel. She asks a question about thoughts on the Digital Health London Accelerator programme. I'd like to broaden that out slightly to the question of accelerator programmes in general. How valuable are the accelerators that we see across the UK and around the NHS, and what value do they have? Matt, do you have any thoughts on that? We haven't heard from you for a while.
We don't actually have a lot to do with those. I would have probably handed that one over to David. But yeah, no, the accelerators we do come across them. I think they have a very valid role to play. There's all sorts of networks that hang off those with various groups of people and conversations that happen. There is a community of people kind of supply side out there that, again, we talked about tapping into hospitals, knowing what's happening on the ground. I think in the digital space, there's kind of networks of just experts in their own little domains that will meet up and have drinks, and that sounds like that's a difficult space to break into, but actually they're quite open groups and open networks, which I think would be something, if you were in that digital space, would definitely be worth exploring.
And David, Matt was kind of passing that ball on to you anyway, but does it, the accelerators, does this fit in alongside, you were talking about the AHSNs earlier on, as places where kind of innovation is encouraged?
It is. I mean, and the whole purpose is to kind of promote innovation, and the key is around. I mean, it's kind of in the title, acceleration. It's about adoption. So, I mean, the NHS has historically been quite good in terms of R&D. I think by per capita, we're second only to America in terms of how much we invest in terms of R&D, but in terms of innovation adoption, we're not as strong. And I think that's been recognized. So things like the accelerator programs, it's all about trying to improve the adoption of innovation at scale. And I think if you've got an innovation where you're trying to, test the market in terms of the NHS, those type of initiatives like that accelerator programs, that they're valuable because it's all about helping to navigate the system. What we find is that companies know their products or their, the service that they're proposing incredibly well. What they don't know is the system, and that's why you find companies that struggle. If you know the system, that's how you get traction. That's how you can sell products or services. It's all about being able to navigate the system. So that these accelerator programs are very helpful in terms of understanding the system and the network and who to speak to, what are the issues, even down to how you would need to kind of commercialize your products. Again, the other observation I have is we have examples of fantastic products which say a clinician has developed, but they're not sure actually how to commercialize it. They haven't thought about the commercial model. So again, these type of programs that are also helpful to advise for the context of the NHS, or particularly, whether it's a hospital or in kind of a community setting, what type of commercial models work or don't work. So again, the commercial aspect is also quite valuable to get the insight.
I think it's really, really important, isn't it? I mean, at the end of the day, again, it's not just the NHS, it's any healthcare system. You've got to understand what your commercial proposition is. Adam talked about the kind of need and requirement to understand the volume and the market size for a particular product or innovation or service. What your commercial model is that fits alongside that, where it fits into the health system, and what the kind of business case is for taking on that product. I think one of the problems I imagine you probably have as a chief procurement officer is people coming with kind of half-baked ideas about something they think might be good when they haven't properly rounded out what their proposition looks like, what it should be, and how it should work. Again, I mean, getting loads and loads of questions through. Quite a lot of people asking questions specifically about procurement. Sarah is asking us what the best way to approach procurement routes would be, whether there's a sort of G clouds or frameworks or whatever. I think probably, firstly, Sarah, and all of you that are asking questions, please do put your company names in there, because that way you'll get a plug. but I think we probably need to think about kind of procurement in the round, don't we? And Matt, if I can come to you first on this, and then probably on to David again. Do you want to explain for our audience a little bit about the kind of general way in which procurement works in the UK? Because I think we are probably more transparent. We have more process around procurement in the UK than a lot of the health markets our audience may be interested in. Matt?
Yeah, and a lot of that, I mean, we were probably doing it, were we doing it before Europe? I'm not sure, but the whole European regs that people have followed for years force procurement teams to be pretty open and transparent. I think now we're outside of Europe. We've got our own procurement regs that are going through the houses at the moment, and that looks like things are going to be torn up again, and new acronyms and new processes and new times to do things. But I think overall we're pretty open as a country in terms of how we procure. The most procurement teams now are starting to publish what they're calling their pipelines of work. So we're getting, rather than just going out to market and saying this is what we're going to buy, you've got X days to respond. The way it's going in healthcare nationally is they're now publishing forward-looking plans, especially on a lot of the more expensive projects and programs, where they're saying, you know what, this is what we're going to be looking to come to market over the next 3 years. So actually for a supplier, you're getting far greater visibility of what's happening. I mean, that's just happening right now. So not that that's, you can go and look right now at that, but it is starting to happen. There's a momentum building from the national work around that through a tool called Atomis. So you are starting to see that side change. I don't know whether David would have a view.
Thanks,
David,
Matt. Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned it earlier. I mean, the key point is to understand who's actually buying, who's in a position to buy your product. So there's over 200 acute hospitals. So potentially you could be engaging or having to engage with multiple hospitals in terms of buying a particular product or service. There is a move to consolidate procurement teams at a sub-regional level. So we've talked about integrated care systems. So if you look around the country, you're increasingly seeing local collaboration where the procurement function is across a number of hospitals within their locality. That's probably helpful because it means there's less front doors to interface with. What we find is that a lot of what we buy is via various framework agreements that are set up through national agencies. So in terms of digital, Cabinet Office have what's called G-Cloud, which is a framework agreement that allows a hospital and other public bodies to call off without a further competition. That framework is deliberately geared to support SMEs, small medium enterprises. It's refreshed normally every 9 months. So if you're in the digital space, something like G-Cloud is a good channel. If it's more around medical devices, then NHS supply chain, they have a whole array of framework agreements. And again, what you find is hospitals will tend to access products and services through those framework agreements. Don't have to. It's not. There is a choice. Generally, framework agreements are used out of convenience. It can be a barrier in terms of being able to get onto a framework agreement. So it's best to try and, depend on what you're trying to sell. I always go back to the point, well, who's actually making that buying decision? And it tends to be the hospital. There is a move towards ICS level procurements, but it's still generally the hospitals individually who are buying. I guess the other context, and again, it depends on what you're looking to promote, is that alongside the big teaching hospitals, you normally have universities. So Guy's and Tommy's, we have a shared campus with King's College London, do a lot of joint research work. The university sector isn't subject to the kind of public procurement regime, so they have more flexibility from a procurement perspective than the NHS does in terms of as a public body. So if you're in a kind of space where potentially your customers are also university based in terms of around research, then the universities have more discretion in terms of kind of due process and procurement. What in terms of websites, Contracts Finder is the government portal. So if you go onto the internet and put in contracts finder, that shows all the kind of contract notices that public bodies publish. So from that, you can get a sense of potential opportunities as well.
Now, that was actually really one of my next questions, was where do you go to look for opportunities? I have a kind of follow-up question, actually, David, if you don't mind hanging on with this one for a second. From somebody identifying themselves only as M, we could definitely do some more detail from our questions coming from. Quite a long question is, it seems that procurement frameworks are open for short periods and infrequently open. G-Cloud 13 and recently, and DOS 6 GPIT Futures is currently closed for a while. How does the panel recommend practically addressing that as an SME stroke startup that might have a shorter business lifestyle than the length of some of these procurement windows? And I think it kind of goes on to frame that question a little bit better. I think, is the UK and the NHS a good environment for small businesses? David, what's your thought on that? I can see Matt nodding away enthusiastic, so Matt, we'll come back to you in a second. David, you first.
I think the UK is, particularly because of the renewed focus on innovation. I mean, we spend a lot on R&D, disproportionately a huge amount on R&D. We have a lot of initiatives designed to encourage innovation. Academic Health Science Network, Accelerated Collaborative, and so forth. We've left the EU, so there's a recognition at a national level that we have to be attractive for business. At a national level, they talk about the UK being a health science, a life science superpower. So from a policy position downwards, there's a recognition that we have to improve and be more attractive to businesses, and healthcare is a key industry for the UK. You may have seen the outcome of the consultation from MHRA in terms of the regulatory framework, where again there's a big focus about how to be attractive in terms of innovation and pre-market assessments, for example, being one of the proposals covered. I'll go back to the point about who's actually making the buying decision. So yes, there are these frameworks, and yes, it can be difficult if their frameworks are not open for renewal, in terms of for different windows of time. But ultimately, it's the hospitals who are making that buying decision. We don't have to use the frameworks. We contract with a whole array of SMEs who aren't on framework, but we still contract with them. So there is a choice at a local level. If your product is strong enough and compelling enough, then people will buy it. But I guess it's about being able to navigate that system. You do also have, you're seeing an increasing use of what's called the dynamic purchasing system, DPS frameworks. The way those frameworks operate is it allows companies to kind of be select to go through a shortlisting process during the life of the framework. So particularly around digital, you're seeing increasingly use of what's called DPS, dynamic purchasing system frameworks, and that does provide you a mechanism for suppliers, SMEs, and so forth to be onboarded onto a framework during the life of that framework. And I mean, Matt may have more knowledge of examples of DPSs, but that is a mechanism which kind of tries to mitigate the downside of a framework, that it kind of locks out suppliers for periods of time.
I mean, I guess and I'll come to Matt, I'll come to you in a moment, but I mean, I guess from my point of view, the question that hammers in my head is, again, David, Matt, in fact, any member of the panel can kind of correct me if they feel that I'm wrong in saying this, but I do feel that while we have a very strong, very transparent procurement process, that doesn't preclude the ability for an organisation that has a good product, an innovative, well-created business case, from going into the system and saying, look, can we have a chat about this? Can we have a chat about whether we've got something that is of interest, that is innovative, that is required within the system? And then people like Matt or David or Adam or Vincent, or any member of this panel, being able to turn around and say, well, okay, you've got something, there's an interest in it. Now there's a question of how we negotiate the procurement process to get that into the system. Matt, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say that's basically, you just described our business. So we started off working with a handful of organisations, proving the value. And I've always said this is our job as a supplier, is to prove the value of what we do. And if we've got a good product and a good service, other people will go on and buy it, and it will almost get a bit of a life of its own. So what happened with us, small business, open a few doors, few conversations, show the value, and then that 9-month G-Cloud window does feel long at times. I mean, during COVID it was longer. I think we're back to 9 months now. But that comes around really quickly, and you've started to work with a few trusts, you've opened a few doors, you get onto G-Cloud, other people then want to buy your services, they can buy you through G-Cloud because it's an open framework, and it goes from there. And that's basically how it went for our own business. Started off small and it's grown over time, but by proving the value.
No, really useful. Vincent, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I was just going to say, a lot of the organizations that we work with don't necessarily, surprisingly, some might say, focus on the frameworks, because there's often criticism that a lot of the frameworks potentially favor, particularly either at the pre-qualification stage or in later stages of the procurement process, either established providers who've already identified, demonstrated value, long track record, have all the financials, et cetera, et cetera. And so we often get clients who are either startups, scale-ups, or new entrants criticizing the frameworks for those sorts of reasons. Whether that's true or not is a different matter. But ultimately, what those organizations find, as Matt's just described, is the route to market for them is directly with the sorts of organizations that David comes from, and others as well. Let's not forget, you've got primary care organizations, many of whom are corporate bodies now, which will be looking after patients that may have 200,000-300,000 patients. So in their own right, they're quite sizable organizations. There's community pharmacy businesses and a whole wide range of other businesses within the NHS providing services. And selling services directly to those organizations, particularly in the NHS, is seen as a route to market that's tried and tested for many of the SMEs, new entrants, scale-ups, etc., because it does two things. It enables them to get their foot in the door, as Matt and David have both described, but also it enables them with a friendly organization that they've got to know to demonstrate their proof of concept. And then in the NHS, what you do tend to see is there is a reluctance for organizations to sometimes be the first to do something or the first to purchase something. And if you can demonstrate your proof of concept with an organization, then that organization effectively, in many instances, becomes part of your sales force, because they will have connections and they will be collaborating with other NHS organizations, and they will be able to recommend, well, we use this product or we use this service here, it would be useful over here. And we see a lot of our clients really gaining scale and coverage through that route rather than focusing purely on the frameworks, which great gets you onto a framework, but most frameworks will have call-off arrangements. And so even if you're on the framework, generally is no guarantee for work unless somebody calls you off. And who's going to call you off? It's the providers that we've just been talking about.
It's a really interesting point that you raised, Vincent, because I think, I do a lot of work, as you know, in the Middle East, and the advice that I give to clients that we're taking out into Dubai or Saudi, or wherever we're going, is that, you need to put your boots on the ground, you need to go and develop relationships. It's a relationship-led market, it's a network-led market. And you could almost be forgiven for thinking, when you look at the behemoth that is the NHS and all of these different acronym-led organisations and the complex structure that we talked about at the beginning, and then these procurement frameworks, you could almost be forgiven for thinking that actually this is not a network-led market, this is not a relationship-led market, but actually it absolutely is. And it brings us back, I think, to a point I made much earlier in the conversation about, developing a network, about being able, having a trusted partner that can help put you in touch with the David Lawsons of this world, and allow you to have the right conversations with the right people at the right level. Relationships, I think, in any form of business should never be forgotten. And the NHS, the UK healthcare system, is still a relationship-led market. I think that's really important. Adam, you wanted to come in.
Yeah, just to touch on the value proposition point. And I think in terms of coming into the market and building those relationships, but speaking to the people who might buy, just understanding that value proposition is multi-layered. So the clinical outcomes are critical, but the amount of people who could expect an improved clinical outcome is as important, because one person getting a magnificent outcome as opposed to 1 million people getting a slightly improved outcome. So I think that's important. The user experience, the rate of adoption will be driven as much by how easy it is to use the innovation and deploy it on the ground as it will be for its outcomes for the patient. And then you're into the lifetime cost and return on investment. So whilst you have to have a solid commercial business case, and some of that is built around the number of people you could impact, actually, understanding and speaking to in a document or in a approach to market, being able to articulate what that means for a doctor or a nurse or a community function or a primary care doctor in terms of what their experience of working with the product would be, matters as much in the round as the return on investment when you finally taking that to business case and to the procurement team. So I think, just don't lose sight of that, what you're about and what your value proposition is multi-layered.
Absolutely. And I think kind of putting together a sensible business case in terms of, probably something that you can help with through the data that you have access to, kind of volume and size of market for a particular product. Equally, Matt can probably kind of look at equivalent organisations or equivalent equipment or equivalent offerings and what's currently being spent on in the UK. Having the data that sits behind it, and also the clinical data that proves that if you've got a solution that impacts a patient, that it works. Put those things together, and that kind of makes an awful lot of sense in terms of being able to create a sensible business case that you could take to any level of the system. I think that's kind of a self-evident and important element. Come to another question that we've got from the audience, and I'm assuming that this is coming from a US organisation, because they're talking here about the FDA as a regulator for medical devices in the US, and asking the question: how does the UK's regulatory regime differ to that of the US, and I guess how it will differ now to that of Europe? I guess, Vincent, would you be the right person to come to on this question? And then David.
Okay, yeah. So I guess our equivalent to the FDA, Food and Drug Administration, here is the MHRA, the Medicine and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. And in Europe, they have their own equivalent, the European Medicines Agency. The reality of the situation caused by Brexit is that in the UK, the vast majority of our regulatory framework for the regulation of medicines, medical devices, and diagnostics is based on European legislation. And following Brexit, as I think David alluded to earlier, the UK government published plans last week on the 26th of June, which followed a period of quite extensive consultation on the future regulatory frameworks that will apply here in the UK. And the intention is that those new regulatory arrangements will come into force from 2023. But ultimately, what it does is creates a situation that there'll be an expanded scope of regulation to cover specific non-medical products, including products where manufacturers claim either only an aesthetic or non-medical purpose, but which are similar to medical devices. So things like dermal fillers or colored contact lenses, those sorts of things. There will be an amendment to the classification rules for general medical devices to reflect changes in technology and an attempt to ensure that the classification rules around which class of medical device you're talking about are better aligned with international practice. There's also an attempt to enhance transparency by increasing the information that's captured and shared at the point of device registration, and a range of other things. But ultimately, it's about introducing regulatory framework that complements what exists in other jurisdictions like Europe and the United States, introducing a UK specific mark called the UK CA mark, which will sit alongside many device manufacturers, sit alongside the CE mark, which is of course what's used in Europe, and because many medical devices will be placed on the UK market as well as the European market, and try to address some of the disparities that the consultation has identified, so as to ensure that the UK continues to offer a really open and welcoming, and in some cases fast-tracked process to get medicines and medical devices onto the market. Now, having worked with clients to place devices and medicines on the UK and in Europe and in America, what I would say, and this may be considered a vast oversimplification, but generally getting devices and medicines placed onto the UK market is more streamlined and somewhat simpler than it is to get the equivalent things into the US market or the EU market. Timescales tend to be less, costs tend to be less. And so, as I say, I think part of what the government is trying to do with the new regulatory regime here is to ensure that that continues to be the case, but in some instances make it even simpler whilst still maintaining robust standards for patient safety.
Thanks, Vincent. David, do you want to come on this point?
Yeah, and just to add to what Vincent has said, so the MHRA published the outcome of the consultation, I think, last Sunday. So again, that's available on the internet. I think it's about 150 pages, but it gives you the full detail. I guess key points is that what they're saying is that we'll continue to recognise the CE mark until I think at least 2026. And I think certificates issued by EU notifying bodies, again, for new devices will continue to be recognised in the UK. I think what's interesting is that from 2026, the kind of basic principle is almost like a risk-based approach to regulation. So for low risk medical devices, low in terms of specific classifications, the UK is looking to accept unilaterally FDA or EU approval. But then for the higher risk medical devices, the proposal is that the new kind of CA mark. And I guess politically, my reading is that they're seeing that CE mark as to be like almost like the Rolls-Royce for in terms of regulatory approval. And I think ultimately this will take time, but I think ultimately the aim would be to get mutual recognition with FDA and the EU, but that will take a number of years, I expect. But I think what's interesting is that there's a recognition that the UK has to be competitive, and therefore has to have a regulatory framework that is attractive to suppliers and doesn't act as a barrier for new entrants and a barrier for innovation.
I think there's a lovely related question that I've just seen ping into my inbox, which I'd love to hear your thoughts on. has Brexit made the UK more or less attractive as an entry, as a market to enter for overseas companies looking to get into our healthcare system? Who wants to take that one?
I'll take it. I guess from a practical point of view, where we're buying from suppliers based in the EU, because we've left the single market, it has increased the friction. So we do have a few hiccups around duties, duty payments, and products being stuck at airports while we release payment. Those initial issues are beginning to kind of iron themselves out, and there's kind of processes and systems in place to manage them through. But operationally, that did initially create a few issues. I guess on the positive side for me is that there is a pressure on the UK to prove the benefit of Brexit, and therefore there is pressure on the regulatory authorities, the kind of health system and other industries to demonstrate that leaving the EU was a good thing, and therefore we're having to work out how to be competitive, how to be more attractive. So that may take some time to work through, but I guess that is the potential positive, that the UK has to be open for business post Brexit.
Thanks, David. Another question then, moving on to another question from the audience. And I guess this kind of relates for me to, again, my experience of the Middle East, where, when you set up a company or you set up a supplier in the Middle East, you have to have a local partner. The question we've had here, how easy is it to set up a company or a subsidiary in the UK? Do I need a local partner or distributor in order to work with the NHS? Vincent, I think that one's directly in your bailiwick, isn't it?
Okay. Yes. So the ease by which one can set up a company in the UK is often surprising to individuals and companies that come into the UK market from abroad, because it is actually very easy. Largely, the most difficult part of the process is actually choosing which company structure is right. And it's a bit of a cliche here in legal land that the form must follow the function. But ultimately, there's a wide range of different company structures that you can have as a new entrant into the UK market. Everything from private limited companies to limited partnerships, limited liability partnerships. And they all have their nuances and different reasons why you might use them. The vast majority of new entrants will set up a private limited company, which ultimately, being the most common type of company, as a legal entity, it's separate from the individuals who run it. It's allowed to raise capital. It will have shares. It affords limited liability protection to shareholders. It needs only one director and one shareholder. It doesn't even need a company secretary anymore. So it is the most common type. But once you identify what type of company you want and have made the decision you don't want to be effectively a sole trader, the next stage is pretty straightforward, really. There's a series of legal documents that need to be drawn up, such as the company's articles, and a director appointed. Those documents are then filed at what's called Companies House here in England. And there's usually you can do that within 24 hours because there's online registration now. Submit all the required forms. As I say, you'll then get a unique, you'll have your unique company name. It will be registered. Your directors will be registered. Your shareholders will be registered. You can then allot your shares. And the whole process is pretty painless. It's also Companies House as a regulator is pretty light touch insofar as there's certain returns that you have to make to Companies House each year. But some of the things that help individuals from overseas is, whilst you'll have a UK-based registered company address, and lots of accountants and law firms act as the registered address for the company, there's no requirement to have a physical company premises. The director's service address will usually be the registered address, as I say, so there's no requirement for the directors to physically live in the UK. Or you don't need UK residency to do this. You don't need work permits or work visas unless you're going to actually employ individuals from overseas. You will need a UK bank account, but you won't need, like in other jurisdictions, as Steve mentioned in the Middle East, you don't need to necessarily have local agents or local distributors, unless, of course, you're importing goods into the UK and you want to establish a local distribution network, which is a slightly different question.
David, is there any kind of need or advantage to having a UK entity or being a UK entity when it comes to being a supplier to the NHS?
I've seen both work and both fail. So it's I think we a few years ago we engaged with there's a US company that were quite established in the US, and they weren't quite sure about the UK market. So their way of kind of testing the water was to partner with a UK based company that then, because they had an established kind of sales team, they were able to sell their system. It was an IT system. And then it got to a point where there was enough traction and enough hospitals had purchased the system that they then took direct control. So it can be seen as to partner with a UK organization can be almost like a test in the water before you commit any of your own investment and start to employ your own people. So I've seen I've seen it work quite well in that context, where companies use it as almost like a test in the water. And I guess it's a slight, you're taking slightly less risk. The only downside of that is normally from a commercial point of view, you have to give away quite a lot in return. So it is very much a judgment call about, and I don't think there's a right or wrong answer. I think it's about understanding your market. And again, I'd lean on people like Academic Health Science Network and engaging with different people within the system to take a view about how a customer would respond to you as a kind of an overseas company, as opposed to maybe an organization that may be more recognized. I think where you're proposing something that's quite innovative, you could argue it, and the product or service can stand up on its own 2 feet. It may not matter less if you're in more of a crowded market. It may be better to partner with someone with more of an established name, able to open doors easier. So it may also depend on the market you're trying to target.
So we've got a couple of hands going up there. Adam, let's go to you on this one next.
I just kind of to build on what's just been said, in so much as the establishment of the legal entity. There's a discussion about the shape of that, so it's right and fit for purpose. The complexity of establishing that company, less so because of the UK regulation. I think, do you come in with a partner? Do you come in on your own with the UK entity? David's point, there's no right or wrong. It's something you've got to work through and look for the best solution for you. Is there a legal requirement or a governmental requirement to have a partner in England? No. Given where we started with the conversation about the complexity and then moving through to the relationships, and there's kind of I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think, is there a legal need for partners? No. Is there a complexity and a need for networks and You know, the rather than hitting it with a hammer, being able to get the scalpel out and go, just that one there. That's the exact spot that we're going to get the maximum penetration. You know, I think from the conversations that we outlined earlier, find your own way, but you could spend, as I have, you know, coming into the NHS from industry, 8-9 years understanding the lay of the land, the networks, the terminology, the data. You could go on that journey, but there are people around who've got the scars and could help you come to market quicker. I think that was just the point that I wanted to make. You know, thanks, there are people out there that do that thing in spite of not being any regulatory need for it.
Thanks, Adam. That's really helpful. And Vincent, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say the one area that is quite different between, say, the provision of goods into the system or non-patient clinical services is one side of it. But for those organizations who are entering the UK market with a view to providing, you know, direct clinical services to patients, you're almost certainly going to want to have a UK entity. You're going to necessarily need to employ people, obviously, to provide those services. And the answers to the sorts of questions we're just looking at are going to be slightly different. So what we do tend to see, because of some of the complexity around that, is those new entrants will often partner up with an existing clinical provider who will then essentially subcontract services to you as the new entrant. It makes it easier, and you're working in collaboration and cooperation with existing providers, not necessarily in competition with them, to provide something that they can't. And that can often be used, and we see it used as a springboard to then go on and win your own work elsewhere.
Thanks, Vincent. So we've got about 8 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is kind of wrap this up. Is I'd like to just go around the panel and just get your kind of top tips. If you had a company with a really interesting offering in front of you that wanted to enter the UK market, what are the 1 or 2 key nuggets that you would advise them? And Matt, let's start with you. We haven't heard from you for a while.
Yeah, so I think it probably mentioned it already, but I'd think about the value proposition. What is it you're doing? Think about who best to go and target. And I still think a conversation with a local team is always the best. It has been in my experience, and you can grow from there. Thinking about how you're then going to do business. I think when you're dealing locally, they're a bit more flexible to kind of bringing you in and working together. As you scale, and you get more customers, you probably are going to have to think about other routes to market, and the frameworks are always very useful for that. So I think they're probably my main tips. And then working with a partner, somebody who just understands this space, understands the data, understands the right people to go and talk to. Because I think if you're approaching this, like everybody said, it can be very confusing, the NHS. But actually, if you can speak to the right people, they can very quickly help you navigate to the right conversation. So you're spending £15,000-20,000 to understand the market, as opposed to coming in and spending $500,000 and realizing it might not be right for you. So I think if you're new to the market, the right partners are probably the critical thing, just to get you started.
Thanks, Matt. Adam, what are your thoughts?
Just echoing what Matt said, you know, that the value proposition is everything, not uniquely, but certainly the fact that the NHS puts that information out in a way that it can be interpreted by people like us and played back into the commercial offer and the value proposition means that the articulation of a product's value in the marketplace is probably easier than where that doesn't exist. I think partnerships in terms of understanding the networks and taking stuff to market, failing fast. I think that's the key, because this won't be a market for everybody, you know, and Matt's point about better to get in, do some research and get out than try and find your own way for 5 years when you could have been A, spending the money somewhere else, or B, focusing on a different market. But equally, when you have, if that initial toe in the water shows a market that works for you, then get into the AHSN networks, the accelerator schemes, because I come back to that early point, we are getting better at keeping people alive, and that's creating pressure that only innovation can solve, and only bringing new products to market will support. We can't do the same thing that we've done for years faster or cheaper. So these interventions, there is a market for them. The value proposition is a language that people are starting to use. It's probably not been a better time for a while to move into this market because of the value proposition rather than the price point competition. That's that. Fail fast. That would be my advice.
It's an interesting point that you raise, actually, Adam, because another element of timing actually speaks to that question we dealt with a minute ago about Brexit. The UK is, as David said in his answer to that question, the UK is under pressure to demonstrate the fact that Brexit has benefits. And from that point of view, I think that there's a really good opportunity to kind of get involved in working in our market at a point where we're wanting to be collaborative, we're wanting to bring in suppliers, we're wanting to bring in investment for overseas. I think that's a really good point. Vincent, what are your top tips?
Thank you, Steve. Well, you may say, listeners may think, well, of course we would say that, but coming from a professional services advisory background, my top tip would be speak to experts early at the beginning of the journey, because those individuals, we can help you navigate the systems, the processes. You can piggyback off and benefit from existing networks through introductions, rather than doing it all yourself. Having those early stage conversations is going to be hugely important in helping you set clear goals about what you want to achieve with your export or market entry plan. You can then, in doing that, I think researching the market that you're interested in, understanding what the size of the market is, what the consumer trends are, the needs and perceptions of either your products or your services, and what competition is already in existence for that, so that you can identify what your unique value proposition actually is. That will, and understanding what regulatory, certification, trade, or other barriers need to be overcome. All of that being done early is my view quite sensible. And then I mentioned earlier, then form follows function. Once you've got that all nailed down and you've got some opportunities lined up, then you can worry about what your mode of entry is going to be, whether that's in country through a distributor or an agent, acquire a local business, collaboration, joint venture, whatever it might be. That has to come second. Often when I'm speaking to new entrants, they worry about that bit first and the earlier stuff I described second. And I think that's the wrong way around.
Absolutely. Don't worry about setting up a business until you've got a product that people want to buy. I think that's key. David, I'm going to give you the last word on this one. I mean, ultimately, you are the guy, you are the organisation that entrants to the market ultimately need to get to and ultimately need to sell to. How do they get to you? What are the best ways of getting a product in front of you and your brethren?
Please don't all email me at once. Is the first thing. Yeah, I mean, colleagues have said think local. Academic health science networks are a valuable kind of early kind of sanity check. You find most of the large teaching hospitals have got close links with the universities, and individually also have their own innovation programs as well. So I think if you approach institutions like Guy's and Tommy's and other major teaching hospitals, generally you'll have an open door in terms of at least to kind of give some early feedback about whether your particular proposition has traction or interest. So I'd probably only echo what Matt and Adam have said around at the AHSNs and that kind of local approach. I think is probably what I've seen in my experience to be the most effective way to I guess to sell into the NHS.
Thanks, David. Well, I mean, from a healthcare world point of view, I think that we've been talking in the fringes of getting this conversation going, of getting this discussion moving about how overseas companies that we meet every day when we're out at HIMSS or Arab Health or Medic or any of the various events that we go to around the world, we're perennially being asked the question, the UK market, you're from the UK, how do we get into the UK? And on the back of this conversation, I'm really pleased to be able to announce that colleagues on this call, Vincent, Matt and Adam and their various organisations, we're going to join together. We're going to try and put together a really simple, easy to understand kind of first gate proposition. Adam talked about the idea of failing quickly. And I think from my perspective, when I talk to companies all over the world on a daily basis, what they need, what's required is a really simple idea of, is there a requirement for the product or service that I've got in the UK? Can I get some good conversations at a local, at a provider level that say yes or no to that question? What information can I get in terms of understanding the size of the market for the product that I'm looking to sell? Well, the stuff that Adam does around analysing that UK NHS data can give us really good understanding of volume and requirement. Equally, Matt and Advising has links to people like David across the whole of the UK that can allow us to have some of those early conversations and can also understand what kind of money is being spent in the market already on those sorts of equivalent products and services. And Vincent and Bevan Britton have the understanding, as I think he's demonstrated, of some of those requirements around regulation and also in terms of how we get market set up. So we will be announcing in the next couple of weeks a Healthcare World UK market entry programme, which will be a low price first opportunity for people to get involved in the UK market. So please keep an eye out for that. Please email me, get in touch if it's something that you'd be interested in doing. It only remains for me to thank what's been a brilliant panel this morning, David, Vincent, Matt and Adam, and apologies for those that noticed that Jyoti Mahan from Healthcare First couldn't make it, technical issues in the north of England. So any broadband providers to the NHS probably would be very welcome. Thanks very much to all. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. We'll see you again at our next Healthcare World Series session. Goodbye.